Alright, this week I'm going to give you guys a quick walkthrough of how I catch striped bass this time of year on the river. We're finally late enough in the year that some of the bigger bass are starting to show up. While the bigger bass are showing up, the river is still cloudy enough that it's really not very effective to fish lures yet. And so the best way to catch these fish is going to be on live bait or cut bait. These fish are feeding really heavily on shad. Where I'm located on the Ohio River, the main forage is gizzard shad, and so the best bait to catch them on is obviously this. I use a small cast net to catch them. These outflows I fish at house a good number of fish. With that water flowing out, the shad tend to school up really heavily right here. An important thing when you're fishing for striped bass is to find those schools of shad. Those fish feed very heavily on those fish right at sun up and sun down, and so right then they're going to come shallow and start attacking those schools of shad really hard. The best bait you can actually use for these fish is a live shad. Anything from that 3 to 5 inch range is going to get you a lot of bites, and it's going to catch you a lot of fish. The problem is the night I went out, anything I could get in the cast net was in that 7 to 10 inch range, which really isn't ideal for live bait. You'll occasionally catch a big striped bass, but you're going to start getting into more flathead catfish if you start fishing baits that size usually. So what I ended up doing is I used these gizzard shad as cut bait. If you cut about 2 inch squares out of those, you end up catching a lot of fish, and it's a very effective bait. The problem with doing cut bait is you do tend to get more catfish that get mixed into the bag, but you do still get into the striped bass very consistently. Now, the one important thing I've found out fishing the river as much as I do these days is it's really important to have a net with you. I've been experimenting with hook sizes quite a bit lately. I've been doing everything from about a 2/0 all the way down to a size 6 or so. And without a net, these fish are just really good at spitting hooks. You'll get them all the way up to the bank, and the second you lose tension trying to lip that fish, they're really good at spitting a hook. Even a 2/0 I've had them do. So just be careful with that. Bring a net. It makes it much easier, especially if you end up hooking into a gar or a larger catfish, something that you can control the fish a little bit. But as you can see here is a striped bass, or a little hybrid striped bass actually, that I caught. You can see in its mouth is a small jig head. That's what I had actually tipped the cut bait on, and I had actually had that on a slip slider sinker rig. And I'll talk about those a little bit more and talk you through the rigs I use. So the one thing I had trouble covering in this video, and I didn't do a good job of at the river, was talking about the rigs I use to actually catch these fish on. The first one I use, and the one I use the most common, is a standard sinker slider rig. All it is a swivel, a section of line that goes out to a hook. You can switch this between a standard hook or a jig head, depending on the current and the flow that I'm fishing. I actually did tend to use a jig head more than a normal hook. For some reason, I have better hookups and less snags with that. That just goes up to a weight. I like to use bank sinkers. You put a bead right here in front of it. That'll help protect the knot. And then that just goes out to your main line. The next rig I use about just as often is when you get really heavy flow. I actually like to use a standard tight line setup. So what this is at the bottom, I've got my ounce, or my weight. This is a 1/2 ounce because the current's real slow right now. And what I do, what some people don't do, is I run a section of lighter line. So this is about 12-pound line up to about 25-pound line with a knot connecting it. What that means is if I get snagged up, my weight will snap off and my hook should be free, especially if I catch a fish. That's actually super helpful. Some catfish like to get you snagged up pretty easily. The knot I use to attach this, it's just a dropper loop. There are plenty of good videos on the internet that'll teach you how to tie that. And then I simply just slide that over onto a hook. This I won't use a jig head on because that'll wrap that down. That's just going to be a standard hook almost all the time. And then the last rig I use, if I'm having a lot of trouble getting hung up, I use a modified sinker slider setup. All this is the same thing as this rig here, except you don't have the barrel swivel right here in the middle. For some reason, if I'm getting hung up a ton on my hooks, keeping that weight right beside, so when it lands, everything is just sitting right there, right in place. Usually you have to size up the size of that weight significantly, up to about 1 or 2 ounces. Depending on the flow, I've done up to about 3 or 4. So that's another option. If you're getting hung up a bunch, this can actually save you sometimes. I hope this video was helpful. This is how I target striped bass from the bank most of the time, so hopefully it helps you do the same. As always, guys, I hope you're getting out and doing some fishing, and good luck and tight lines.